That's right. So my name is Tamás Dóczi. I will be moderating this session. It's a great privilege for me, and I'm happy to introduce later our speakers as well. Before I do that, I would like to share with you some technical information. As you could hear from the computer voice, the meeting is being recorded, so feel free to switch off your camera, and as long as you stay in the meeting, that means you actually consent to being recorded. Later this session will be posted on the ISSA YouTube channel, so you will get the link of that later. Some of you have already seen it because we have the winners of the graduate paper award already presenting their research. So yeah, now we start actually, and of course the title of this session is The Future of International Sport Events in a Post-Pandemic World. So as I see from the number of participants, it is an interesting topic. I start with showing you this. You probably don't see it too well, but it's I got this from a friend of mine with the sporting events of 2020. It goes well until about this point, and then from this on, it's pretty useless. So actually, we know what happened, and we also know that sporting events in the recent decades have been subject to a lot of debate, especially with regards to their social impact. And I think in this period, the period of COVID-19, we have even more debates and even more questions arising with regards to this topic. So just if we look at some of these photographs that we have here, you can see that we started pretty much, from the top left corner with, big crowds at events. We have the cardboard fans. We have the social distancing protocols. We have also, people wearing masks, also the temperature controls. And finally, well, the photo of the next Olympic Games, whenever this is going to happen. So I think we have really an exciting topic on our table. And now I'd like to present our four speakers. Well, now just briefly. So the first one is Young-Woo Lee, Jay. The second one will be Billy Graf Bastos. The third one will be Jules Boykov. And the fourth one will be Laura Meisner. They all were very kind and accepted our invitation for the first time, really. So I really look forward to their presentation, and I think I'm not alone in this virtual room. So I think, we can start now, and the first speaker will be Dr. Young-Woo Lee, Jay, who is a program director of MSc Sport Policy, Management and International Development at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. Dr. Lee is the guest editor of an annual Asia-Pacific Sport and Social Science Special issue of Sport in Society, was a recipient of the Taiwan Fellowship in 2018. He's also a special contributor to a British social affairs magazine, The New Statesman. His work appeared in a number of peer-reviewed journals, such as International Review for the Sociology of Sport, Journal of Sport and Social Issues, Sport in Society, and the International Journal of the History of Sport and Communication and Sport. He recently edited, with two co-editors, the Routledge Handbook of Sport and Politics. Dr. Lee is currently writing a book entitled Sport and Nationalism in Korea, Power, Diplomacy and Identity. Dear Jay, the floor is yours.
Well, hi, everyone. I feel very much honored to be in these special occasions. And my name is Young-Woo Lee from the University of Edinburgh and in Scotland. And I'll share the screen first. Hang on a minute. Yeah, so today I'd like to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has raised the tensions in the world politics and share my view on how the Olympic Games in Tokyo and Beijing may reflect this rather fluctuating international relations in the post-COVID-19 world. So I can consider two potential scenarios with regard to the politics of Olympics during the pandemic. The first scenario is that the Olympics would become less political. Now the IOC and then the Tokyo Organizing Committee plan to stage a simplified Olympic Games in an attempt to make the Tokyo 2020 COVID safe. And they have recently stated that the opening ceremony may not include the Parade of Nations. Additionally, due to the international travel restrictions, a number of the international politicians visiting the host cities and attending the opening ceremonies is likely to be small. The absence of these world leaders and the removal of the Parade of Nations from the opening ceremonies can make the Olympic a less political event. The second scenario is that the Olympic Game even more political. The coronavirus pandemic reveals the fragility of neoliberal world order. The global production and supply chains in many industries, including sport, have been seriously affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And many nation states have begun to realize the importance of relative self-sufficiency of their economy. This has given rise to the surge of the nationalist politics in many different parts of the world. And this increasing competition for national self-interest has been weakening the collaboration aiming at the mutual prosperity between nations. In this context, the Olympic Games in the post-COVID world can turn into a stage where the political ambitions of nations and the tension between them are actively displayed. Now, it is probable that the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing present a political theater where the power game between China and the West, and notably the US, will be performed. Recently, Chinese foreign policy has become more ambitious. The One Belt and One Road initiative reflect Chinese political and economic expansionisms, and its Made in China 2025 plan aims to revamp its images from the world factory of cheap product toward intellectual hub. With this increasing economic and political influence of China, the US is particularly wary of their hegemony in the neoliberal world being challenged by China. America's the Indo-Pacific strategies is essentially the policy to check the China's expansionism in Asia. At the same time, the two giant economies are embracing nationalist politics in order to secure their domestic political capital in the face of the oscillating power balance in the international system. The outbreak of COVID-19 has further worsening the US-Sino relations. President Donald Trump is blaming China for being the origin of the Wuhan virus, where China once suspected the US to have covertly spread the virus in Hubei province. In the middle of the pandemic, President Xi Jinping sent a signal of reconciliation, saying that China has no intention to fight either a Cold War or hot war with any country at his speech at the UN General Assembly. Despite this, China's skepticism in the West show no signal of being abated. This situation has created a public space where Chinese poor human rights record and also each controversial re-education camp in Xinjiang province are openly criticized by Western intellectuals and Western journalists. In this context, a voice against the 2022 Winter Olympics Games in China is gradually being emerged in the West. And even the British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab commented that his country may boycott the Beijing 2022 if China sustained its oppressive practice against the Uyghur, the ethnic groups. On the other hand, China wants to project an image of its rising power and its brand of the world intellectual hub, including its vaccine nationalism through the Olympic Games on their home soil. So if this trend continues, then the 2022 Winter Olympic Games may take place in the coldest political climate ever. And the fluctuating international relations in the post-COVID-19 period has been worsening geopolitical tension in Northeast Asia too. It appears that the Tokyo 2020 will not be immune from this political situation. Even during the preparation stage, the COVID-19 related geopolitical tensions and nationalistic rivalries overshadow these Olympic Games in Tokyo. The relationship between Japan and South Korea have been uneasy, complicated due to their unfortunate colonial past. Their relationship today is particularly low due to the recent trade war between them. In the midst of these escalating tensions, the Japanese government certainly closed its border to Korean people without notice when the South Korean city of the Daegu became the epicenter of the coronavirus. In March, objectively, these Japanese reactions against the outbreak in South Korea can be understood as an understandable decision, given that Japan was about to host the Olympic Games in a few months' time, and it needed to protect the country from the virus in order to stage the Olympic Games without much disturbance. Nevertheless, the South Korean government considered such a unilateral decisions a diplomatically disrespectful gesture, and these perceptions provoked a deep-seated anti-Japanism in South Korea. This surge of nationalistic feelings further intensified the force of anti-Tokyo 2020 campaign in Korea, which had first appeared earlier in this year when the Korea-Japan economic dispute started. Some radical nationalists were even calling for a boycott of the Olympic Games in Tokyo. This fierce demonstration continued until the IOC decided to delay the Olympics for 1 year in late March. Partly due to this postponement, the rallies against Tokyo 2020 in Korea has now mostly been subsided. But nevertheless, the COVID-19 has certainly brought additional complexity to the sensitive relations between Japan and South Korea. And the 2020 or 2021 Olympic Games in Tokyo is likely to mirror these old four relations between the two sides. So now, as the closing remark, I expect that due to the social distancing measures and international traveling restrictions in place, the Olympic game itself would contain a less political element as shown in scenario A, if the Olympic game is to take place as scheduled despite the pandemic. Yet, given that the COVID-19 has worsened the various international tensions and dispute, the Olympic game is likely to offer a platform where a few ambitious nations demonstrate their power and hegemony in the coming years. And this makes these Olympics potentially the most politicized games ever. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jay. I think a very interesting opening speech, and already showing us that we really don't know whether it's going to be cooperation or competition first. How these already existing and previously existing tensions may be reshaped because of this current situation. And of course, yes, we will see how it unfolds in connection with the two next Olympic Games. Now I'd like to give the floor to Billy Greff. So first I introduce him. Dr. Billy Greff is a senior lecturer of the sociology of sport at the Federal University of Rio Grande, Brazil. Billy has focused on topics such as sport mega events, sport and development, and Olympic studies. He has recently published the book Capitalism, Sport Mega Events and the Global South by Routledge, and is currently developing the research project South American Sport for Development Voices and Sustainable Development Goals, with funding from the Advanced Olympic Research Grant of the Center for Olympic Studies. So please, Billy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. So first I wanted to start thanking ISSA for organizing this virtual Congress, and especially Tamas and Parissa for organizing this panel, and also Jay Lee, Laura, and Jules for accepting this challenge and not letting me here alone. Very strange in front of the computer. And finally, thank you all in the audience, once I know that none of us can handle more live or distance learning, teaching. So the first thing I wanted to tell you is that I prepared this presentation based on a view from a certain point, and this point is the Global South, or specifically Brazil. So I have already, Thomas has already mentioned this book that I released last year. And yes, this is shameless advertisement, but it's also to allow you to know that this book is out and that we can talk about it at any point if you want. And also to prove to my brother that I didn't publish this book only to please my mother. Okay, so when I talk about sport mag events, I talk about Brazil, about the place where I'm from. So I look at it from here. In 2014, for example, the Brazil Football World Cup costed 6.5 billion pounds, of which 5.8 billion pounds were made available by the Brazilian government. And end of 2014, FIFA took to the global north, to Switzerland, more than 3 billion pounds. 2 years after that, into 2016, almost 6 billion pounds were expended in the Olympics. And again, Brazilian government made available almost 3 billion pounds. And then end of 2016, the IOC took home almost 2.5 billion pounds. So there is a little suspicion when a person like me speaks about sport mag events. So the way I organize my talk today is that I wanted to tell you that I have been observing a few trends relating to more to the broader context, but also in relation to sport mag events. For example, the rise of international capital and class, and how this may have influenced current policies of sport mag events according to their financial inclination, to the detriment of the developmental perspective lent to sport mag events in the past. So there was a change when the transnational capital became the dominant capital within global capitalism. And also because it made capital more agile, more mobile. So it changed the way things are done. Also, territorial expansion. Sport mag events territorial expansion in this century occurred in the wake of the need to search for profit, as any other capitalist territorial expansion, and as I showed you earlier in relation to Brazil and the World Cup and the Olympics. And then you have this fractionation of the productive process and outsourcing and offshoring of productive stages, which means the moving of productive phases to where cheaper labor and less rigorous labor, environmental, and human rights legislation can be found, but also maintaining the centrality of decision-making processes and profitability within the global north. Then something more recent, shock doctrines. So Naomi Klein states that shock doctrine centers on the exploitation of national crises, disasters, or upheavals to establish controversial and questionable policies, while citizens are too distracted emotionally and physically to engage and develop an adequate response and resist effectively. And also hybrid wars. So according to Andrew Korybko, I even put the link for his book there. This presentation is going to be available in my ResearchGate profile. I'm going to send you the link afterwards, to show you the link afterwards, but also in the presentation in ISSA's YouTube, you are going to be able to get it. So it is a military strategy which employs political warfare and blends conventional warfare, irregular warfare, and cyber warfare with other influencing methods such as fake news, diplomacy, lawfare, and foreign electoral intervention. By combining these operations with subversive efforts, the aggressor intends to avoid attribution or retribution. That has nothing to do with Bolsonaro, Trump, and Boris Johnson or anything like that, of course. If CIA, FBI, MI6, you are listening to me, I'm not talking about you. Specifically about sport mag events, then two trends I wanted to tell you about. The first one is the dominance in certain niche of research of ex-ante factor research against ex-post factor research, which means that much of the knowledge that we have on sport mag events is built on predictions, and predictions on top of predictions sometimes. And also the use of a discursive research by promoters and defenders of sport mag events. For me, a discursive research can be considered the use of loquacious strategies about a certain phenomenon, using information chosen to build a desired image of the referred object. So these are the global trends that I have been observing. Then specifically about COVID-19, from my point of view here, locked in my house for 6 months, I have been watching what's happening around me, and for me, this pandemic has enlarged the distance between the poor and the rich. And now you have worse conditions, living conditions and working conditions, at least here in Brazil, and maybe we could say in the global south. We have more frequent and voluminous looting of state coffers because the financial system needs to be saved. We have an increase in debt, even new or even due to non-payment, widespread bankruptcy, and an increase in virtual reality, pay-per-view, streaming, and other digital strategies, increasing technological dependence. Okay, so very quickly now, I want to tell you that I prepared a few curiosities that I have in relation to sport mag events at this period that we have been living and thinking about the future as well. And I was inspired by this thought of Paulo Freire, that the role of the teacher, the professor, the lecturer is to transform spontaneous curiosity, naive curiosity, into epistemological curiosity. So if a student asks you, why are rows red? Then you may teach him about DNA or genetics or something like that. And I guess I even have a link there which explains curiosity from the point of view of Paulo Freire in English, if you want to see it afterwards. So a few curiosities, so naive curiosities from my point of view. About Tokyo, we just talked about this with Jay. So can the IOC skip Tokyo? Is it possible? Is it necessary? I have talked to a few friends in Japan, and they say that even the venues that they would use in 2020 are difficult to get now for 2021. Are we going to have more sport mag events in the Global South? Apparently, I don't know, not sure. And then you have a lot of human rights policies put in place by FIFA and the IOC. Are they going to work? So how is this new digital culture affecting sport mag events in the future? And how is the pandemic going to affect the search for young people as spectators? Will researchers in the field forget the past, or are we going to have more and more ex-ante research? And how will sport mag events incorporate the pandemic into their discourse? So this is just my curiosities, and now to finish, I wanted to share with you a few bets. So if you have some money, please bet against me. So the first one is that whatever happens, FIFA, the IOC, and other institutions are not going to lose money. I bet my money on that. And also, I believe that the whole selection process will become increasingly identified with on-demand capital, prosumerism, or advanced tailorism. So you're not going to have a dispute anymore. You're going to have something combined between the promoters of the games and hosts, possible hosts. I also think that in the near future, serious organizations linked to human rights are not going to be part of this process that was started by FIFA and the IOC a few years ago in order to tackle human issues, because I guess there are more important things for these institutions than human rights. That's what history teaches us. And for me, the IOC doesn't get young people, and this attempt on them is not going to be successful. Yeah. Despite the evidence to the contrary, FIFA and the IOC and others will incorporate to their discourse only positive elements regarding their participation in the pandemic. And unfortunately, I think research funding in the area will focus on future perspectives instead of assessments and evaluations of the contributions of sport to the spreading of the coronavirus, or even ways of having sport contributing to the making of a better world after the pandemic. So thank you for your patience. Here you have my research gate in which you can find this presentation, and also my email if you want to get in touch with me. So back to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Billy. First of all, I think it is very important that such session as this one includes the voice from the Global South, and I think Billy is really the right person to join us in this debate. Of course, everybody is free to make bets with Billy. You have the chance to get in touch with him. I think also it is clear that besides the answers and the ideas and the predictions that we have and the bets we make, we have a lot of questions. Billy also, I think, offered us a lot of questions to think about. So I think we got another slice of this complexity, which of course, besides the athletes and the fans and the organizations, includes a whole complexity of different stakeholders. So now I give the floor to Jules Boykov, and first I introduce him. He's a professor of political science at Pacific University in Oregon. He's the author of 4 books on the Olympics, most recently in Olympians, Inside the Fight Against Capitalist Megasports in Los Angeles, Tokyo, and Beyond, at Fernwood Publishers, and Power Games, A Political History of the Olympics, Verso. His writing has appeared recently in academic journals like the International Review for the Sociology of Sport, Sociology of Sport Journal, and the Connecticut Journal of International Law, as well as outlets like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and The Nation. A former professional soccer player, he represented the US Olympic soccer team in international competition, so he has different points of view. Jules, the floor is yours. And we still,
okay,
yeah,
thanks.
okay,
All right,
there you
get
go.
ready to go here. All right, well, thanks very much. And today, basically in my prepared remarks, I just wanted to go through the wider trends in when it comes to hosting the Olympics and explain why they've generated criticism. And then second, discuss anti-Olympics activism that has popped up around the globe in the 21st century, in large part in response to these trends that I'll be talking about. The first trend is escalating costs. There's a well-known paper that comes out every time there's an Olympics that looks at the overruns for costs, and it found that every Olympics since 1960 has run over budget. Tokyo's no exception. It originally was supposed to cost $7.3 billion and has escalated to more than $26 billion, according to an audit by the Japanese government. Of course, postponement will increase the cost. The best estimates, and that's all we have right now, is $2 to $6 billion, and those have come from the Japanese media. Pyeongchang similarly doubled its cost over time. Rio escalated its costs. Sochi was originally supposed to cost $12 billion and escalated to more than $50 billion, which at the time was more than all previous Winter Olympics combined. Then you even have London, which many people consider to be a success story. It started at 3.8 billion in the bid documents and escalated to 18 billion. And that's, by the way, an underestimation compared to what Sky Sports said and other people who looked at the cause. A second trend is white elephant venues, so leaving behind stadiums that cost to maintain them, or as we'll see in a second here with the case of Pyeongchang, just totally scrapping them. So this stadium here was created for the Olympic Games. Originally, when it was pitched, it was supposed to be there afterward for people to enjoy in the local community. Instead, as you can see here, it was scrapped, brought down entirely. It only hosted 4 events and then brought down. So it's almost as if like a new genre of stadium, like a disposable coffee cup or something. There's also the ski run that cut through a 500-year-old forest for the Olympic Games and is not really being used as much as the organizers had hoped. Of course, there's Rio. These photos were taken only a few weeks after the Olympics left in 2016. You can see these empty venues, which cost a lot to maintain. And of course, Brazil more widely was experiencing serious economic problems and was not able to upkeep the stadium. We also have the trend of displacement and gentrification. The general trend is in the global south, you see displacement, the sort of iron fist of displacement, whereas in the global north, the velvet glove, if you will, of gentrification is more common. I was in Tokyo around a year ago with the sports writer Dave Zirin. We were running around finding what was going on and covering the games as they were building up. And we met some women who are displaced by both the 1964 Olympics as well as the 2020 Olympics. And just a side note, they did not want us to include their photographs or even their names in our story for fear of retribution for speaking out. This is a photo I took in Rio de Janeiro. I lived there as a Fulbright research scholar. This is from Vila Autódromo. It's a community along the Jacarepaguá Lagoon there. You can see the athlete village in the distance, and it was totally decimated, this community, in order to make way for a parking lot for the Olympics. They did have 20 new build homes in a separate area from where this photo is that all looked the same. And so there was a victory for the community who fought back, but most everybody else was displaced to different parts of the city and the community was shattered. Of course, Beijing is the sort of key example of massive displacement. The 2008 Olympics displaced 1.5 million people to make way for those Olympics. The fourth trend is militarization of public space and the bringing in of new technologies to do that. So in Tokyo, it will be the first Olympic Games to have every single venue feature facial recognition. Here's some photos I took in Rio de Janeiro, where there were 85,000 security officials on hand. That was double the number of London 4 years earlier. One thing that concerns a lot of people who are willing to express their political beliefs is that a lot of times activism and terrorism are falsely equated, which is to say conflated. This page is from the bid book for the Rio Olympics, explicitly lists activist and terrorist targets, risks in one area. Rio's not alone though. In London, when the security head of the Olympics was asked what he thought were the key risks to the games, he listed terrorism, protest, organized crime, and natural disasters. You can imagine what the protesters were feeling like, being sandwiched there between terrorism and organized crime. In London, there was intense militarization. You had surface-to-air missiles in the area. You had them also ratcheted onto the roofs of apartment complexes. And because of the fact that G4S fell on its job, it was supposed to provide numerous people to provide security for the London Games. A number of military officials were called in to fill in for them, many just fresh back from Afghanistan. A fifth trend is greenwashing, so talking a big green game, but actually not following through with big ecological promises. The International Olympic Committee has taken sustainability into its rhetoric. In the 1990s, it made it a third pillar of Olympism. This is a photo I took in Tokyo, or actually in Fukushima, and that was when I was there in July 2019. The Tokyo Games have been called the Recovery Games as a way of trying to shout out the recovery that's happening in Fukushima after the triple whammy disaster of the tsunami, earthquake, and then nuclear meltdown. And so here you can see bags, large black plastic bags full of soil that are in various stages of decontamination. The recovery is absolutely not over, at least when I was there, and it continues today. And in fact, a lot of the people that I interviewed were very critical of that moniker, the Recovery Games, because they felt like a lot of the resources were being diverted to Tokyo instead of coming down into the Fukushima prefecture. I mentioned before that a 500-year-old forest was knocked down in Pyeongchang to make a brand new ski run for those Olympics there. And this is a photo I took in Rio de Janeiro along Guanabara Bay. The big promise around the Rio Olympics was that 80% of the water that filtrates into Guanabara Bay, where there were going to be some of the athletic events taking place as well, 80% was going to be filtrated by the time the Olympics rolled around. Unfortunately, nothing of the sort happened. I took this photo just a few days before the Olympics started. You can see that they put up these sort of thin barriers, but they weren't doing much to stop the pollution from coming through. And in fact, by the end, when the Olympics arrived, only about 25% of the water flowing into Guanabara Bay was being filtrated. I guess you could say there were some green spaces in the sense that they painted the ground green around the location of the events. And so maybe from a helicopter's view, you might say that it was some green games. London introduced this idea of the sustainability partners, but you'll see up there that they had BP, which is probably not what everyone here thinks about when they think of sustainability, which raised a lot of concerns on the part of activists. Speaking of activists, they've been coming out more and more and getting stronger and stronger as we go here. James Baldwin, you can see, suggests that we need to face up to our realities, and that's exactly what these activists have been trying to do. This is from Hamburg, which led a successful campaign to stop the Olympics from coming there in 2024. You saw the campaign in 2026 in Innsbruck get scuppered by activism. In fact, between 2013 and 2018, 11 potential Olympic bids have been torpedoed because of pushback on the part of active people in those countries. Boston is an example here in my country, where I come to you from, that stopped the Olympics from coming there in 2024. Los Angeles has a vibrant anti-Olympics movement called No Olympics LA that is pushing back against the Olympics, while at the same time, as I'll talk about in a second, creating a sort of transnational movement that has long been lacking in anti-Olympic circles. I wrote a book about them, if you're curious about their strategies and tactics and how they originated out of the Democratic Socialists of America and have a concertedly socialist approach to fighting against the Olympics. You can see here, this was in Tokyo. A collection of people from around the world came together for the first ever anti-Olympics transnational summit. So you had activists from Rio de Janeiro, from Pyeongchang, from Seoul, from Tokyo, of course, the two main groups there, Hangarin no Kai and Okatoa Link, as well as people from Los Angeles that sent the biggest contingent over there. This is a poverty torch that was shared, created initially in Vancouver, made its way to London, has gone to each Olympics after that, and it's now in Tokyo. So there's a sort of transnational linkage there. You can see this, a lot of the people from Los Angeles created a No Olympics Anywhere slogan, which is kind of their big thing right now, trying to make this a global pushback. You see activists from Paris on the left there, as well as Los Angeles and Tokyo. This is not the first time this anti-Olympic summit that people have come together to push back against the games. There's been protests in Rio that you can see here, as this was at Vila Autódromo. There's been pushback against the Sochi Olympics, although it was much more difficult to carry out in Russia. You can see what happened when the Pussy Riot group did that. You had a Cossack that literally whipped them in the streets. London similarly pushed back on that issue of greenwashing. You can see they were in Trafalgar Square here, and they were actually arrested for that. You have Vancouver, where the Olympics happened on unceded land of the Coast Salish people. And there's a big anti-Olympics movement there as well, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist. So we're in kind of an interesting moment where there's a lot of pushback. The issues around the Olympics have become more apparent to more people. The International Olympic Committee, as I'm sure we'll talk about in the Q&A, has been fairly slow to move on these key issues that I've raised here. And they've kind of been more interested. There's Thomas Bach, the head of the International Olympic Committee on the left, and just trying to keep everything going and keep all the Olympic partners happy. But as Stuart Hall reminds us, hegemony is never forever. And we have a big fight on our hands, and it'll be interesting to see what happens here. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jules. I think very strong presentation in visual terms as well. So seeing the photographs, I think lets us all imagine and see how actually these protests happened. I think it's very important that there is an internationalization of protests against the Olympic Games. I think this is very important. And of course, yeah, I think you raised the question as well whether, for example, the IOC and other international sport organizations can be held responsible for anything that is going on at the host countries. So I think now I introduce the fourth speaker today, Laura Meisner, who is an associate professor in the School of Kinesiology at Western University in Ontario, Canada. Her research focuses on how sport and events can be used as instruments of social change, with an emphasis on how events for persons with disability can positively impact community accessibility and social inclusion. She has also authored and co-authored a number of books, more recently Global Sport Leadership by Routledge and Leveraging Disability Sport Events, Impacts, Promises and Possibilities, also by Routledge. So, dear Laura, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We have a large audience with us, which is exciting. It's always a challenge on a panel that's as illustrious as this to go as the last speaker, because there's so many great ideas that have been communicated already. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some things from my perspective, in particular, my interest around local community and development associated with the hosting of various types of mega events. And I'm going to steer our conversation a little bit away from the Olympic and Paralympic Games and talk about some of the other events. And in particular, I'm going to use an example of a current situation going on in Canada, where we see a local community that is attempting in a post-pandemic world, in a hopeful post-pandemic world, to host an event, but we see some of the challenges associated with that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those eventscapes. And of course, you know, we're well aware from the conversations that have been going on in the sporting landscape, and particularly from the conversations today, that you know, this pandemic has really exposed some of those inner workings of sport and what's actually happening. But it's also demonstrated the interdependencies that there are between the local and the global. And so while I I come at this as always with cautious optimism. I'm not sure at this point in time my optimism is very overriding. I think the influence of the global has increasingly impact on those local processes, and there are points that are interconnected as they've never been before. It means that no sporting nation really is an island. And we need to be thinking about how those intricate interconnectivities impact upon the local, in our case, the provincial or state and the national regulations. As noted, there's an upheaval in the early postponement of some of these major events, but they've really led to an eventual change in how we might think about the possibilities around these events and the eventscapes. The advanced commoditization and the hierarchies that are created in our contemporary global sport have been impacted by the structural imbalances present in this pandemic. But does it present us then with an opportunity to create some changes, to influence, to think differently about those emerging localisms? And as Jules has pointed out, rightfully, some of those things have been strong forms of resistance, but there might be other forms of localisms that emerge as an opportunity that's created by this catalytic event. And I'm going to use this example of Hamilton. Hamilton, Ontario is bidding for the 2026 Commonwealth Games, as many know. And the interesting piece that we see in this is that there's a real recognition by events in the current landscape that they need to justify why an event should be hosted by a particular region, the value for the community, the impact potential. So there's a real recognition that those criticisms that we've seen coming from previous games are real, and that we need to be thinking about what those impacts might be for the local community. What we've seen is those hypothetical chains of production of the potential social outcomes for events being disrupted. And if one of those chains is disrupted, then it breaks down the entire production chain. So we need to be thinking more clearly about how this will impact upon the local community. As pointed out, economic impact tends to be the #1 thing we go to when we start to think about events. And in the current pandemic situation, cities, and particularly those small communities that have been impacted so heavily, are concerned about the economic situation. In a city such as Hamilton, which some of you know, some of us lived there for a period of time and know that it is a place of, it has gone through some difficult times. And so the use of an event to fix social problems, to fix the ills of the past is not unknown. But in the current time, there's a real concern about how that's going to happen. And what we've seen is there being a real pushback from not only the local level, but a provincial or state level, discussing the issues and saying that the province isn't willing to support games like this in the current time. So we need to be thinking more clearly on the questions about the future. We're talking a lot right now, and we're hearing a lot about what's happened in the past, but we need to be thinking, how is that going to impact what we might want to do in the future? And it's really heartening to see communities stepping up, as Jules has pointed out, and saying that this is not the right thing for us at this point in time. So really, the current pandemic has also become a site of contestation where inequities have been exacerbated and highlighted the challenges of local community involvement in such large-scale related events. The virus didn't cause these sporting inequalities, but it really helped to exacerbate them. And it starkly reveals sport's reckless dependency on some of those small entities, as we've talked about, the IOC, Commonwealth Games Federation, to create an injection, an infusion of capital that will support the problems, the concerns of a local community. But the inadequacy of this trickle-down effect marginalizes those in many situations further. And from my own work, I speak a lot about those individuals with disabilities and the parasport landscape, women, lower level professional sport or semi-professional sport, and the inadequate funding that is offered to grassroots sport programming. From my own recent research around our return to sport plans in my own country, what we've actually seen is those who are typically marginalized, so those individuals with disabilities or those with less access to sport participation, are being further marginalized in the process. And events and eventscape will only further exacerbate that. But cities are struggling. They're struggling with the idea that this is their baby, this is what they felt to do. So they're attempting new ways to reach out to community and perhaps creating new opportunities for community voice to come into play. And I use this example as an opportunity that was presented and I participated in a virtual community forum around Hamilton 2076, an attempt to recognize that there are issues associated with hosting an event, but potentially there are some opportunities to leverage what the event can offer. So I'll leave you some thoughts around the community-centered approach, because as we know, these events are continuing. Cities are continuing to want to host them. And as Mueller pointed out, the notion of the event syndrome can lead to events being used as the fix for urban problems. And the concern in a post-pandemic era is the attempt to use events even more so to try and fix some of the economic problems, to fix some of the social inequities that have been exacerbated by this pandemic. But the event is always and is largely disconnected from the community and really does tend to fail to meet the needs and desires of local citizens. But I leave in a little bit of an optimistic note because, as many of you know who know my work, I tend to focus on some positive social change and the potential opportunity that events might be able to do. It doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting that an event cannot be an opportunity for social change and that it's not possible in the context of events to leverage these things. But what we need to be thinking about is where our interests lie when we host these events in the future. As Jules has pointed out, events aren't sustainable and we're not meeting that place, but we need to be thinking about not only profit, not only environmental issues, but also the people, the social variables in those communities, education, equity, social resources, health, and well-being. And it's only at the intersection of thinking about all of these three things that we might be able to create an eventscape for the future that's going to support community interests, community needs, and a strong community development agenda. Thank you, and if you'd like to touch base with me, I'd be happy to chat more about my talk.
Thank you very much. I think the last figure, showed it all really, how many different perspectives we need to take into consideration. I think it's all for our learning. Of course, it's also important to take the views and the voice of the local communities concerned, and I think it is really a question now that you mentioned whether there will be plans that these events be used to fix certain problems in the communities and certain urban problems. And most probably it's difficult to be optimistic in this sense, but I really appreciate your optimism. Okay, we are through with the presentations. I think we have touched upon a lot of interesting topics, interesting questions, some concerning generally the question of international sporting events in the 21st century, some more specifically also to address the question how COVID-19 is going to reshape perhaps some of the issues that came up. We already have a few questions in the chat, so we'll move on to them right now. And all of you are encouraged to put some more questions if you're interested, if you have a target. Write to everyone, but you can write to who the question is addressed to. So we start with a question from Pinar, who was asking actually Jules about the composition of people who are part of these protest groups. So the question is, are the oppositional groups connected to specific parties or specific political movements, or it's not that simple?
Right, yeah, it's definitely not that simple, and it varies by city. The form of anti-Olympics activism that comes up in a city very much depends on the local structure of the activist community in that city. One thing that we have seen, though, like for example in Los Angeles, is that it tends to emerge out of already existing activist groups. And so they basically, what happens when the Olympics roll into your city, they have all these effects, social, economic, political effects, And that those effects tend to sort of roll over the toes of different activists from different groups who realize their interests are being damaged perhaps by the Olympics. And so they come together. One thing that's interesting about anti-Olympics resistance is that it's not necessarily a simple right-left thing. Activism can come across the political spectrum. So for example, in the one Olympics that was in fact scuppered after it had been given to a city, that's Denver, it was given the 1976 Olympics. Activists across the political spectrum teamed up there, from leftist environmentalist types to fiscal conservatives on the right side of the political spectrum, who said that they didn't want the Olympics. They came together, they actually put a referendum on the ballot, and they voted no money for the Olympics. And the International Olympic Committee was forced to move those games to Innsbruck, Austria. And so I would say in general, the anti-Olympics activists that I've worked with are separate from political parties themselves, but come from already existing activist groups, and they come together. What's interesting in the wake of the Olympics is that a lot of times I've noticed that the groups that came together to fight in the Olympic moment build solidarity, and then they tend to keep working together after the Olympic moment. So in a weird sort of way, the Olympics can help strengthen activist communities in the host city.
All right, thank you very much. I asked the other panelists whether they would like to add something to this question. So the composition of activist groups, I mean, you come from various countries where also there, has been substantial activism against mega events. So if anybody would like to add something to it.
I wanted to tell you that in Brazil we had a very nice movement called the Popular Committees of the World Cup and the Olympics. Chris Gaffney wrote a chapter on this, and we are probably going to see a few papers on this experience at some point as well. And it was a really good experience because it, in a way, approached scholars with militants from social movements in Brazil, very strong social movements as the MST, the Landless Workers Movement, and also the Homeless Workers Movement, MTST. So they helped to build these popular committees, and they actually managed to conquer a few things for people being affected by this event. And that's a story that has to be told, and hopefully you're going to know more about this. But if you are interested, please try and check Chris Gaffney's chapter about this.
Thank you. If you'd like to respond, I let you, but if not, then actually we have now a question from Emmanuel. As she says, inspired by all three, by three speakers, whether the future is for less bloated events that are more meaningful to the places in which they are held. So can we expect such a turnaround? Let me think. Laura is smiling, so I think maybe you have...
Sure, I'll take that. I might actually answer Jay's question at the same time that he asked me about the resources from the local, because I think it dovetails nicely with the conversation we're having here around activism as well, is that I think what we're seeing is in many of the, and I steer away from Olympic because IOC is a beast in of itself, but some of the other events that are out there, there being a stronger social agenda tied to those. So for example, with Commonwealth Games, there's a requirement for there to be a local involvement committee. So the communities must, or there is a creation of a community committee that actually works with the organizing committee around particular social issues in the social agenda. And what we're seeing is those committees actually emerging in advance of the bidding process for this. And they're steering the direction in a different way. And we know in Canada, for example, from Calgary, a similar thing happened to what Jules has described, is that the citizens pushed back and said, we want this on the agenda. We want to be able to vote on whether we want to spend our money on this, and put that referendum to a vote. And obviously we know the outcome of that, and Calgary's not hosting. So that citizens are having more of a voice, and there is the opportunity for that voice, and it's making events and the large scale committees more accountable. So there are resources, and I think one of the things we have to remember is that when we talk about resources in our communities, we don't necessarily mean money. We need to think about the assets that our local communities have in and of themselves, the knowledge resources that based within the community that can be capitalized upon. And I think the activist groups are a real good demonstration of how that comes forward. But those can come forward in a variety of different ways. And we're seeing that through some of the community partnerships with even health organizations, community sport organizations, and those are happening in many places in Canada where events are being sought.
Okay, thank you. Okay, others maybe about the question of whether these events might be transformed in shape. And thank you also, Laura, for answering Jay Coakley's question already. So can we expect a reshaping?
Well, just quickly, I believe in the human being, so I believe things can be transformed, but history teaches us that we cannot be naive in relation to that. And from my point of view, while we still have this type of organization in which friends of friends take places in committees and things like that, and money drives all the motivation, then the games are going to be the same. Yeah, so we need actually very profound transformations, and I don't think the ISSA or FIFA the place where we are going to build any type of international games in which the human being comes first.
Oh well, hard to be optimistic, of course, given this huge complex that we have around these mega events. I'd like to ask Jay now, also a little bit similar question. You talked in your presentation about the events or the Olympics being more or less political. I'd like to ask the question, what you think about actually whether the Olympics will be held in 2021 in Tokyo, and if yes, then how is the decision-making process going to evolve? Or if no, then how is the decision-making process going to evolve?
Okay, that's a very difficult question to answer because no one can expect what will happen in Tokyo. But what I observe now is that in last week, London hosted the London Marathon, and it was the citywide competitions, and there was no public allowed to see the marathon itself, but the athlete can take part in. So this indicates that at some level of international competition, which require large city space, can take place with some social distancing measure in place. So I think if Tokyo adopt more simplified approach, which cut the number of the visitors, but only allow athletes to come into their country, and then some form of the Olympic game may take place. So in my view is that it's quite difficult for the IOC and also the Japanese government to cancel their Olympic plan because they already invested huge amount of money in there. So my personal view is that Olympic game is likely to take place in Tokyo, but the scale of the Olympic game can be much smaller than its ordinary Olympic games. And also, I got another interesting view. It's not about your question, but about the political party and activism and so on. And what I observed in Pyeongchang a few years ago is that the most activists are from the Seoul area, metropolitan area, but Olympic game itself took place countryside area. So local people living in countryside are mostly in support of the Olympic Games. And I think in order to make the voice of the activists heard, then the local politicians also support their view. But what I've seen was that in the Pyeongchang area, the various political parties from the radical left to the radical right, all supporting Olympic campaign, because if they didn't support, they win the vote in the next general election. So there are kind of limitation between the activism and their connection with political parties. So regardless of your political paradigm, if you are radical left or right, their main concern is being elected. So they need to consider local people's view as well. So if local people are supporting the game, then even though your individual political view is supporting the anti-Olympic game, but they had to remain in silent at least, or keep supporting local people's Olympic Games. So that was what I observed during the 2018 Winter Olympic Game in Pyeongchang.
Okay, thank you for your insight, and I think it's really interesting also about the protest groups. I think we had a bit similar situation with the Budapest 2024 bid, actually, that it was more of the urban population, especially the population of Budapest, which was a bit against or had its concern in connection with the hosting the Olympic Games, and people living in the rural regions were much less opposed to it, but that's also a little bit in accordance with the political situation. We have a question from Donovan Lee, specifically targeting Jules, but of course others are also free to tap in. Has the IOC responded or took any action against those anti-Olympics activists? So how did the IOC prevent such activists from ruining the games? So the role of IOC in handling protests.
Sure. So by and large, the International Olympic Committee tends to avoid acknowledging activist groups because that just raises their profile. Let's not forget, despite everything I just talked about with anti-Olympics activism on the rise around the world, it's still an incredibly asymmetrical battle that's happening, where you have local activist groups that are under-resourced against one of the most heavily resourced groups in the world. I mean, they've got $2 billion in their coffers or so in their reserves, the International Olympic Committee, according to their own records. Those might be depleting because of what's happening with Japan, but the point still stands. And so the general trend is that the International Olympic Committee doesn't even acknowledge the existence of activists. Now, sometimes activist questions, or ones that are at least inflected with the interests of the activists, do make their way to people like Thomas Bach, the head of the International Olympic Committee. This just happened around a week ago, where a reporter asked him what he felt about the fact that in Los Angeles, the Black Lives Matter chapter there and many other activist groups that are part of the No Olympics LA coalition are against the Olympics in terms of what it'll do to local populations, especially people of color. And the response from Thomas Bach was just like a hemming and a hawing and a festival. He basically didn't answer it. He kept trying to deflect and parry. Finally mentioned Muhammad Ali kind of randomly at the end, as if like the history of Muhammad Ali is going to deflect political activism. And so that's kind of been the overall approach, to be honest. In an asymmetrical power situation, the International Olympic Committee has basically decided that it doesn't even want to acknowledge activist concerns. Now, there are two places where there could be leverage against the International Olympic Committee. One is among the sponsors, who seem to still be holding steadfast with the organization despite its troubles. And second is the pushback among local groups. You know, you mentioned, Tomas, what happened in Budapest. That was one of the 11 cities that I mentioned that scuppered their bids because of active involvement from the populace there. That's the other way to undermine it. And so what you're kind of seeing is the International Olympic Committee, because of activist concerns and because of a lack of interest in the Olympics, at least hosting them, kind of going more toward countries that have dubious human rights records. Let's not forget that the 2022 Olympics that was handed to Beijing, despite the fact that the 2008 Olympics did not lead to an improvement in human rights as the organizers promised, for those 2022 Olympics, it was only two cities left at the end of the day, Baku, Azerbaijan, and Beijing. All the other cities that were from putative democracies had dropped out at that point. And so that's kind of an interesting global trend to keep an eye on here. Is the International Olympic Committee taking refuge in places that don't value human rights as much? And the last thing I'll say on this is, like, yeah, I say all that with a lot of hesitation, because the country that I'm coming to you from in the United States, unfortunately, it's incredibly easy to stand around and China bash. You see it from both the Republicans, of course, our president calling it the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, but you also see it from Democrats that in some ways have come out to the right in their China bashing. So I say that with a lot of of hesitation, but there's no question that human rights have kind of, they're spoken a lot from the podium of the International Olympic Committee, and they're not exactly followed through. And last thing, Los Angeles, you could argue pretty easily Los Angeles is a human rights disaster. I mean, anybody that travels to Los Angeles and sees the homelessness crisis there, where the official count is around 60,000 in LA County, but the reality is probably about double that according to some NGO work. How can you not look at that and see it as a humanitarian crisis in plain sight? So when I talk about the human rights issues and problems, I'm not just pointing my finger elsewhere. I'm also perfectly willing to look at my own country here in the US.
And it is much appreciated. And of course, we are, I think, aware that the crisis related to COVID-19 in terms of economic and social impacts, has been dramatic in many parts of the world. And of course, I think it's an important question for all of us to raise, how sport and the sports sphere should take responsibility to address some of these concerns, despite the fact that, of course, it cannot take responsibility for everything. There is an interesting question from Pinar again, related to the Deaf Olympics. The question is that there has been recently some improvement in collaborations between IOC and Deaf Olympics, and the question is whether some developments could be captured regarding this communication, and whether the pandemic has had any kind of impact on this, maybe negative impact. I think maybe I turn to Laura with this question, given her expertise.
Sure. It's an interesting and complicated question around the various organizations such as Deaf Olympics, Special Olympics, and the Paralympic movement. The IOC has allowed those organizations to continue existing and use the title, the name of Olympic, because they see no threat from those organizations, and they see it as a social value for them to allow them to continue to use part of the name within that. But what we haven't seen is any real collaborations between the IOC and any of those organizations previously. Deaf Olympics is as an interesting history of not wanting to be included in the Paralympic movement, and therefore has sought out other collaborations within events. And there's an interesting, we don't have time to discuss all the historical pieces around the disability studies perspective of this, because it's quite complex. But it's an interesting development. I don't know, and to be fair, I don't know whether there is any impact right now on those discussions of the games moving forward based on the pandemic. But what I can say from my own work is that anything related to disability impairment associated with anything in sport is being marginalized in the reinvestment in sport processes. We've just done a review of all of the national sport plans in Canada and the return to sport, and none of them actually discuss anything about parasport, Deaf Olympics, or Special Olympics. So that is being very marginalized in the return to sport processes. So I would not be surprised in the slightest if we're also seeing the same thing happening in this potential collaboration between IOC and any of these other organizations.
Thank you. Now we have a question actually from Parisa to Jay. So it is in connection with the fact that the pandemic has intensified. Well, it's hard to put it better, as she suggests as well, anti-East Asian racism in many places around the world. What do you think? Can it impact the hosting of sport mega events in East Asian countries? So will governments maybe double their efforts to bring home such events, or to repair their reputation or identity? Or how does this complicate or not the work of those who are resisting the hosting of major games? Please turn on your microphone.
Yeah, I just turned on my microphone. Then we need to think about two different the trend I observe in political domain. So what I've seen from the researcher's point of view in the West it's not simple the racism against Asian people, but also I can see the loose alliance of Western liberal democracies against Chinese communism. That was the one trend I can see. So when it comes to the relation between China and the West, then Chinese government they try to reclaim or repair their identity through the Winter Olympic Games in 2022, as I mentioned earlier. They try to highlight and improve images. They are more scientific technology and they're even medical science. They even claim that they're now developing the vaccine and vaccine can be used within a few months' time. And also they also claim that once finished product of vaccines are made, then they can circulate the vaccine for free to most developing countries. So that is why Chinese government may do in terms of the Olympic Games. But in relation to other East Asian countries, and such as South Korea, Taiwan, and to some extent Singapore as well, even though I can also see that East Asian racism exists in the pandemic situation, but if you understand from the viewpoint of those East Asian countries, they are very much feel proud of the fact that they control coronavirus very effectively than many other Western countries. For example, South Korea, the test and trace system was very, very effective, and less than 200, 300 people has died so far, where in the UK more than 40,000 died. And in Taiwan as well. And also South Korea and Taiwan is one of the few countries who resumed their professional football in May, which is the earliest time period. So there may be some Western countries to see that East Asian as one single cohort, but if you look at examining situation in each countries, maybe South Korea and Taiwan, they want to host more the Olympic, more mega sporting event to demonstrate the effective treatment of coronavirus. So I think that's my view. So you can see, we need to differentiate the Chinese relationship with the West and also Korea and Taiwan's relationship with the other countries also.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Actually, we had 2 days ago a session in connection with protests and pandemics and protests, and the last speaker over there, coming from Taiwan, Sean Chen, he also emphasized how actually Taiwan kind of benefited, of course, understand it as I mean it, benefited from treating the virus so well and opening up its championships for international audiences as well with English broadcasts. So actually, yes, there are in this respect interesting outcomes of this situation, clearly. Okay. Kyung Yim Kim offered some more on pretty much the same note regarding vaccine nationalism, something that you mentioned, Jay, in your speech. So any thoughts on securitizing Olympic site, especially from health medical concern for athletes? So of course, we've observed a number of championships and leagues taking place in bubbles, asking us, of course, lots of questions about human rights of athletes. So how do you see this? How do you envision securitizing the Olympic site with regards to the health of the athletes?
Okay. Yep. It's to my question also. Yep. I think that's the very difficult question. So I would say it's not, well, I would rather say securitizing, but I would rather more say a quarantine Olympics. So all the athletes, quarantine, COVID safe area, and nobody could, if nobody could enter. I think there's now, I think I want to have a more conversation with Laura as well. So Birmingham going to host Commonwealth Game in 2022. And what Birmingham is one of the hotspots of coronavirus in the UK now. So what the local government trying to do is the kind of concept of the quarantine Commonwealth Games. So they put all the athletes in the university resident hall, and then they can, they got a secure transportation from the resident hall to the competition venue. So in that way, they try to organize more COVID-safe Olympic at the Commonwealth Games in that way. So I would rather say that it's more about quarantining mega event rather than the more securitizing the mega event.
Thank you. I think we learned an expression here as well that we might be using a lot next year, the quarantine Olympics. Okay.
Last second, I was just going to add to that. An interesting conversation that's broiling around that, of course, is in the parasport landscape, and the fact that when we talk about the idea around quarantining athletes in advance of the games, we're talking about a much larger entourage of individuals that come as support personnel for Paralympic athletes and parasport athletes, because the needs for support are much larger. And so there is discussion around whether they're going to allow those individuals to also quarantine in those spaces. And what does that mean for high performance for these athletes? Is it marginalizing those athletes to not allow them to have the support services because then they can't come? So there's a lot of things that are happening around that in terms of in the name of security that further marginalize those who have differential access needs.
Actually, just a quick follow-up question to that. So, can you actually imagine that this situation might separate Olympics and Paralympics in terms of whether they are held or how they are handled or organized?
It's quite possible. I mean, that discussion's been boiling for a long time on whether we should have them separate, distinct, integrated, of course. And this might be one of those cases where they're going to say, though, there's such differing needs, or at least the projection they're giving is there's differing needs. That's a very contested idea, but that there's such differing needs that we do need to maybe separate that out. And Birmingham's already having those discussions around because they haven't actually announced what sports will be included in the games, particularly the parasports. They don't announce those until a year out from the games. They don't announce classifications until several months out from the games. And part of that is then they can control actually who is coming and what that will look like. So I could foresee that having implications around the potential separation of those events.
Okay, thank you. I see no more questions now. I'd like to just bring up something that Billy was talking about, actually, the tour of mega events in the global south, whether it's over or not. I think it was among your bets, Billy, if I'm not making a mistake here. So, and you?
No, it was in my naive curiosity list.
Okay, so yeah, my question would be, and of course I welcome all the others to reflect on this. But first, Billy, do you think it's over, or what are some of the reasons for it being over, and maybe some of the reasons against it being over?
Well, my research taught me that they decided to come here because everybody was coming here. So we have all the big companies having their part of their production processes in the global south now because it's cheaper. They thought it would give them less headache because we don't have environmental and labor legislation in place to tackle some of the issues that they know they are going to offend. But there was something that they didn't imagine that took place, and that was, especially in Brazil, the protests. It is difficult to translate that, but let's say in 2013, during the Confederations Cup, at some point, one day before the first game, the government had a meeting with FIFA, and they were discussing actually canceling the Confederations Cup. So that was something that they couldn't predict. And on the other hand, I guess human rights stuff and environmental stuff also. So their image became associated with things that they are not actually willing to bet, not even against me. I don't have that much money. But on the other hand, apparently they don't have where to put these big games anymore. Now you're going to have, I don't know, World Cups and Olympics in 3 different countries or cities. So they are desperate to put it in wherever they can fit it. So I guess we are not going to have another bet. If I lose some of this, then are gonna have even less money. But I guess for some time we are not going to have sport mega events, at least in South America and Africa. Maybe other places that are associated with the global South, but have different conditions, and maybe they have petrol or something like that. Then maybe. But for now, if FIFA or the IOC, they can secure games everywhere, but the global South, they will do that, and I have the evidence for that is the games in Paris and Los Angeles now.
Thank you. Other panelists maybe have a view on this, how the hosts, the composition of future host of these bigger events might change or might stay the same. See, maybe Jules.
Sure. I think it helps to just sort of slow down and think about who actually are the people who sit on these bid committees for these large mega events. And it's sort of obvious, but I'm just going to say it out loud. It's not like everyday people in their city decide, you know what, I'm going to invest a lot of my money to bring the Olympics to my city. Doesn't happen. It's the political and well-connected economic elites of a city that decide, or a country in the case of the World Cup, that decide that they want to put forth a bid. The bidders are largely comprised of economic elites, and they exist around the world with the polarization and wealth that was discussed earlier in the session. That's not going away anytime soon. And so look at Los Angeles, where you have people like Casey Wasserman, who's sort of a sports media tycoon, who along with the mayor, Eric Garcetti, has put forth this bid. This wasn't an organic bid from the people of Los Angeles. In fact, many communities in Los Angeles have very negative memories of the last time they hosted the Olympics in 1984, when the militarization of public space was intense, and where, according to one Japanese reporter who was in Los Angeles at the time, the whir of helicopter blades was like the official sound of the Olympics as the games approached. And so a lot of people have negative memories. So I think that we could see bids from all around the world, where, because political elites are getting richer and richer off this crisis around the world, and they're going to want to do things with their money. The Olympics are incredibly popular so long as they're not happening in your city. And so I would think there's going to be continued bids from around the world.
And also I think the Euro 2020 would be another interesting case to look at in terms of the host of the sporting mega event, because can you hear me? Well, okay. So the Euro 2022, the Euro 2020, which was postponed to 2021, it will be held overall European cities. Used to be one country, but UEFA adopted the policy that the European Championship do not hold in one single country, but they take place all over the European cities. So what they decided was one place for the final match, very final. So this can be another useful example where the sporting event is not take place in one single country, but in a wider continental area. And then a very grand final will take place particular venue.
Yes, indeed, an interesting solution. Yes, Jules?
Just real quick, I agree. I think that's a really astute observation. It's just that in the coronavirus world, that is a total nightmare. Like people crossing borders, moving all around, having a willy-nilly from country to country. I mean, that's basically creating the world into this huge petri dish for coronavirus. So maybe like way down the road, once everybody's vaccinated and we've gotten through this thing as a global community, yeah. And I think, like I say, I mean, you're totally correct that is the trend, but it's complicated by coronavirus, no doubt.
Yeah, exactly. Budapest was supposed to be one of the hosts, and some of you may know that this year's UEFA Super Cup was held here in Budapest in September. Actually, the members, well, I think the president of the UEFA called it a test game, which of course can be translated to in various ways, whether you are for or against this situation. But I think it's a big question, yes, how the traveling of fans and also the traveling of the athletes can be resolved in such circumstances. Okay, I don't see any other questions, and actually I think we have spent a bit of time here online, so probably it's time to do some movement outside, or for some people to take their breakfast coffee or their evening wine or tea or whatever they like. So I would like to thank all of our panelists for their thoughts and their activity, and I think I'd also like to thank all the participants for being here, for attending, and also for asking us the questions that you know, made the flow of this discussion even better. I am very happy to have had such a great audience, and I think this is the time when, just very briefly, I'd like to say that I think you know, we are through the whole week of online panels, and I think they have been great, all of them. It was nice to you know, be in the community in some weird way, but still. So I think maybe some more events like this might come up, but more hopefully something, an event when we come out of this room and then you know, spend time together with the sandwich or a cup of coffee. That would be even nicer. So thank you for all, and of course I'd like to thank Parisa for organizing the whole series of panels, as well as particularly this one. So thank you, and bye-bye.
Hope to see you in person soon. Next
Yes.
conference.
Yes, in South America, please come.
Yep.
They have very good wine in Chile.